So President Trump thinks he might be getting led on by Vladimir Putin, as in Putin doesn't actually want to end the war in Ukraine. And I mean, yeah, but at the same time, Russia seems pretty happy with how things are going right now. So much so that their foreign minister Lavrov went on CBS Face the Nation earlier today, giving an interview where he said, hey, kind of like what we're hearing, especially from President Trump. Now, as a little context here, about 48 hours ago, President Trump posted, hey, Vladimir, stop firing missiles into Ukraine while we're trying to put together this ceasefire deal. And it was the first time, really, we've seen any public pressure from the United States on Russia, albeit just a comment to saying, please stop. He followed that up following a meeting with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy at the Vatican during the Pope's funeral, where he said, quote, and I'm going to put the whole thing on the screen. I'm only going to read a part of it because it swerves, to say the least. He says, quote, no matter what deal I make with respect to Russia and Ukraine, no matter how good it is, even if it's the greatest deal ever made, the failing New York Times will speak badly of it. Little Peter Baker, the very biased and untalented writer for the Times, followed his editor's demand and wrote that Ukraine should get back territory, including, I suppose, Crimea and other ridiculous requests in order to stop the killing that is worse than anything since World War II. A little context there. Peter Baker wrote an article that came out that same day in the New York Times titled, quote, How Trump Plays into Putin's Hands from Ukraine to Slash in U.S. Institutions. Clearly, Trump not a fan of that article or the author, so that's the whole first part of that post. But moving into the second part here at the bottom, he says, with all of that being said, there was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas, cities, and towns over the last few days. It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war, or he's just tapping me along, and he has to be dealt with differently. Through banking or secondary sanctions, too many people are dying. We're going to get to some reactions here in the United States from that, but immediately we did get a post from President Zelenskyy talking about this meeting, which produced some pretty cool pictures, if I can say so, like iconic looking pictures here of those two chatting. And Zelenskyy said, quote, good meeting, one-on-one, we managed to discuss a lot. We hope for a result from all the things that were said. Protection of the lives of our people, complete and unconditional ceasefire, reliable and lasting peace that will prevent a recurrence of war. A very symbolic meeting that has the potential to become historic if we achieve joint results. Thank you, President Donald Trump. Now, look, it's stark difference in these pictures from the last meeting between Zelenskyy and Trump in the White House, where things just blew up. And, you know, that was in front of the cameras, and there were a lot of people there wanting to get, including reporters and senior leaders in our administration, wanting to get their jabs in on camera, it looked like. And I like this. I like the two leaders sitting down. You know, it's not being recorded. It's off the record, if you will, maybe is the right way to put it. It seems like we can probably get a lot more done that way than having to posture in front of cameras. But nonetheless, we did get some reactions from leaders here in the United States today on some of the Sunday news shows, starting out with National Security Advisor Mike Waltz talking about how it might be time to layer on some new leverage to Russia. Let's give that a listen.
Well, you saw also in that truth, Maria, that he talked about potential action on banking, potential action on the oil and gas sector, but he's determined to use both carrots and sticks to get both sides to the table. Indirect talks, talking about those items that we discussed to drive this to a permanent end with European-led security architecture.
Now, he's not really getting into specifics, but again, let's step back, big picture. This is really the first time we're hearing the idea of using sticks for Russia, right? We've got the carrot and the stick. We've used a lot of stick against Ukraine. Seem to have been using the carrot with Russia, talking about easing sanctions or inviting them back into the global economy or stopping arms shipments to Ukraine. This seems like the first time, really, this series of events that we might be coming down a little harder on Russia than we have in the past. That said, the same time this Waltz interview is going on, we heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and my takeaway from his comments here are like, we just don't want to do that. If we can avoid making threats, we want to avoid making threats. But let's give it a listen.
Who now says he wants to deal with President Putin, quote, differently through banking or secondary sanctions. Will President Trump follow through with imposing new sanctions against Russia?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to, the president, we have multiple options, frankly, to address this and to deal with all of this, but we don't want to get to that point. This is still not the time. I think what the president is saying and has been saying for some time now is he's aware that he has these options. People ask him about it all the time, but what he really wants is a peace deal. He wants the dying and the killing to stop.
Now, of course, from the officials in the administration, we're getting points of view that are very supportive of how things are going. We've got a different take here from former National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Before diving into that, just want to let you know, earlier today, we published an interview where I spoke with 2 artillerymen in the Ukrainian Armed Forces. They operate the Crab self-propelled howitzer, and we're working on a fundraiser right now to try to get them a couple electronic warfare jammers to protect their equipment from Russian drones. I'll link that interview in the description below, as well as the fundraiser. If you're able and interested and want to contribute, we'd love it. No pressure, but at least check out the interview. I think a lot of really interesting information about the nature of modern artillery war. But turning over to Jake Sullivan, again, former National Security Advisor under President Biden. And he said right out the gate kind of the same thing that a lot of folks are looking at right now, saying it seems like Trump might be starting to get the hint that Putin is just leading him on. Putin is not the one here actually interested in peace. Here you go.
Look, the major kind of fundamental fallacy that I've seen from the president coming in the first 100 days is that Ukraine is responsible for this war and Ukraine is responsible for stopping this war. And that has it upside down. Russia started this war, not Ukraine. And it's Russia, Vladimir Putin in particular, who's the main obstacle to getting a ceasefire. And there have been moments when it seems like President Trump might have gotten that. Today may be one of those moments. Unfortunately, every time there's a glimmer of recognition that Putin's responsible, President Trump snaps back and puts all the pressure on Ukraine and makes more concessions to Russia. I hope that doesn't happen again.
He does say.
Now, to the interviewers' credit here, they said, hey, at least they're talking, right? I mean, is that more than what was happening when you were in charge, Mr. Sullivan? And Sullivan's answer here, I'm not fully on board. I don't think this was the right approach. I don't think that this was handled very well under the last administration, but let's give that a listen.
You were National Security Advisor. The Biden administration went nowhere with this, with trying sanctions, you didn't engage with Russia. So now you're saying it's okay to engage with Russia. When you look back, would you have done something differently?
Well, first of all, we did engage with Russia. We had multiple channels to talk to the Russians, and we talked to them throughout.
But certainly not in the way they are now.
No, because one of the things we recognized while we were in office was that Putin was at that time not prepared to come to the table to do a deal that would generate a just peace for Ukraine. So we recognized we had to actually build more leverage for Ukraine. And in the closing months in office, we surged military equipment, we tightened sanctions, we seized the proceeds of Russian assets, and we got Europe to come along with us in all of that. So we handed off to the new team quite a bit of leverage for Ukraine to get a good deal at the table. I hope they do not end up squandering that leverage.
So look, my personal pushback there, personal opinion is I don't know where this leverage was coming over Russia, if at all it was moving very, very slowly. There's a lot of opportunities where we may have been able to increase that pressure on Russia to move in the negotiating table. I have a hard time looking at the last 12 months of the Biden administration and saying that that was clearly some sort of strategy. Like, if it was the strategy, I don't know that it worked very well. So that's been a criticism of Sullivan's policies and everything under the previous administration. And I've laid it out before. I just don't know that we had a clear strategy of getting from point A to point B. The weapons were flowing, the intelligence was flowing, but was it really ramping up, forcing Putin's hand in any meaningful way? I mean, the Kursk incursion that is just kind of wrapping up right now, by all accounts, Ukraine didn't even tell us about that because they didn't want us to maybe leak that or tell them not to do it for any number of reasons. So were we really doing a lot at that time? It's hard for me to say confidently that we were. Now, continuing on with Sullivan, one other clip here. A point that he makes that I think is pretty valid is we're kind of opening the door, what we're doing right now, to allow Putin, kind of giving Putin the signal, keep on going. In fact, ask for more. Here you go.
If the United States continued to supply intelligence and weapons, continued to squeeze Russia with sanctions, continued to keep the unity of the transatlantic alliance, I think Putin would ultimately recognize he cannot achieve his objectives in Ukraine. But by instead making a series of concessions to Russia and telling Ukraine, we may cut you off, it's given Putin the opening not only to keep this war going, but to potentially get a better deal than he should get by any rights or that he would get if we in fact sided with Ukraine as we should.
Now, wrapping up here, we've got, again, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov going on CBS Face the Nation today, and he had a couple pretty interesting comments. I want to start out with this first one where he kind of pushes the anchor here and says, hey, why don't you ask me about what Trump says about Crimea? Clearly, they like what they're hearing in that regard. So let's give that a listen.
Why don't you ask me about President Trump's position on Crimea?
You liked what President Trump said about Crimea when he said that it had been under Russian control since 2014?
It's not about liking or disliking. It's about the fact that he said the truth.
President Trump said Crimea is not even being discussed right now.
Yes, because this is a done deal.
You mean Russia occupies and controls and will not negotiate the future of Crimea? Is that what you're saying?
Russia do not negotiate its own territory.
But then also, and I'm glad they pushed this, they said, hey, why are you guys not accepting a ceasefire? And we've essentially heard this before, the whole idea that why would we agree to a ceasefire that somehow puts Ukraine at some sort of advantage. But here it is, straight from Lavrov.
Ukraine accepted on March 11th that idea of a U.S. brokered ceasefire without preconditions. You're saying the preconditions are a negotiation to end something else?
No, it is not a precondition. It is the lessons learned after at least 3 times the deals similar to the one which we are discussing now.
Yeah. But Russia has not accepted that call for a ceasefire.
The Ukrainian regime with a strong support from European capitals and Biden administration. If you want a ceasefire just to continue supply arms to Ukraine, so what is your purpose? You know what Kaja Kallas and what's his name, Mark Rutte said about the
NATO
ceasefire.
Secretary General and the European Union.
They bluntly stated that they can support only the deal which at the end of the day will make Ukraine stronger, would make Ukraine a victor. So if this is the purpose of the ceasefire, I don't think this is what President Trump wants. This is what Europeans, together with Zelenskyy, want to make out of President Trump's initiative.
So I don't know, that feels a little bit dodgy to me. I mean, you'll hear the argument from both sides. Somebody will say, why would Russia agree to a ceasefire? Because Ukraine can rearm and reequip. And people say, why would Ukraine agree to a ceasefire? Because Russia can rearm and reequip. Seems like something that those two have to come to terms with, right? And I think it's worth mentioning, again, at this point, like the reporter said, Ukraine has accepted multiple ceasefires. So they clearly, whatever the risk might be for Russia rearming and having time to rest and maybe take on the next phase of this war, Ukraine views that as an acceptable risk to get to a ceasefire and the possibility of a long-lasting peace. For right now, Russia, they're not even looking at that ceasefire option. So we'll have to keep an eye on it and see where it goes from here. But again, if interested, be sure to check out the interview with the artillerymen, the Crab systems, down in the description below. And if able and interested in contributing to that fundraiser, we'd love to have you. Hopefully get them a couple jammers here before too awful long. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.